Welcome to Methodically Processing Systems. Whenever I played games growing up, I always had this idea that I was learning skills that I could apply elsewhere in life. I thought playing Risk or Axis and Allies or Neuroshima Hex at the table, or games like Age of Empires on the computer would help me become a better strategic thinker. After all, these were strategy games, so surely a strategy game would teach me strategic thinking. The more I played these games, the more I came to understand their rules and mechanics. And I'll be completely honest with you, I despise reading rules. Nothing turns off my brain faster than having to read rules for a board game or even a video game. The manual that comes with games is a spawn of boredom sent from hell, as far as I'm concerned. So my approach to learning games and winning them quite often, as my friends and family can attest, is to just play and observe the process of playing. I'll be bad at first, but I figure out how to win by the end. Anyways, as you go through this process of observing and playing, you start to figure out the game, of course. You start to learn what works and what doesn't work, and you start to develop strategies for winning the game. You learn the strategy of the game. So, for example, in a game like Age of Empires, you might learn the strategy of rushing your opponent. So, that's this idea that you try to set yourself up for speed. You want to build yourself up to the point where you can go on the offensive and hit your enemy before they have a chance to even think about defending themselves. It sounds really good, and it is. In Age of Empires, 90% of the time I could overwhelm an opponent by rushing them, and I'd win. So I started thinking that maybe this is also a good strategy for life, to rush ahead of everyone else, to get ahead of my competitors before they could even realize there was a competition. Now, thankfully, before I had the opportunity to apply my newfound knowledge about strategy, I started playing a different mode of the game, and I applied my strategy of rushing there as well. Suffice it to say that it didn't work nearly as well. The reality was that I had not actually learned a general life strategy. No, what I had learned was a very effective strategy for playing one particular mode of Age of Empires. And even within that mode that I had learned, the strategy itself depended on who I was playing against. The moment I switched modes was a moment that my strategy lost its effectiveness. The moment I came up against a player who could repel a rush was the moment that my strategy no longer worked. So, my strategy lost its effectiveness within the context of the same game, just with slightly different starting conditions with mildly adjusted rules. Sometimes just by playing a different opponent. Now, realistically, there was not much hope that this strategy would be effective in the real world. What I'd learned, thankfully at a relatively young age, is that knowledge doesn't translate gracefully from one situation to another, despite what we would like to believe. Playing strategy games didn't make me good at strategy. It merely served to make me good at playing those particular strategy games, and even then, the strategies that I was learning were constrained to particular conditions within those games. Change the rules, and the strategies break. See, games are these very well-defined spaces. The rules are definite. The things that can and can't happen are knowable because someone designed them. They have to be this way, otherwise the game would break. So, even when there is randomness, that randomness is constrained to what the designers intended. A game that is truly random, without any constraints, is oftentimes not considered a good game at all. So creators make games with conditions that don't vary that much. Otherwise, players would complain that things are unfair, or even worse, badly designed. Games are simple to complicated systems. Rarely are they complex, though they can be. We've talked about this on the show before. The real world is the very opposite of that. It's messy, it's fuzzy, it's complex. Most of the time, you have no idea what's going on, and you sure as hell can't make heads or tails about what the rules are or aren't. Even when you think you do, there's a good chance you're wrong. So, if a strategy can't even translate within a well-defined game, what hope does it have of translating from the game to the real world? So imagine if I had decided to take my brilliant video game strategy of rushing, which worked quite often, and I applied it to something like building a company or a technology. I would have gained no advantage, because real life, as we've said, is not delivered to us in a well-defined package where there's such a thing as a single strategy that can be optimal in the most number of situations. Make no mistake about it, however. This is our great illusion. The notion that we can learn something in one specific domain and then apply it just as easily in another specific domain and have it all work like magic. And yet, most people fall for it. They preach it. You probably have teachers, coaches, parents, all of whom may have been a part of that great chain of misleading indoctrination in your life. They played games and sports, and they were taught that they could take what they learned in one domain and miraculously apply it to everything else in their life. And of course, it's all nonsense. All of it is. No one has the answer to every problem. No one can solve and handle everything that life throws at them. In fact, there are many people out there who apply the strategies that they learned in school and end up failing entirely. The moment that most people transition from this fantasy world into the real world is the moment they realize that they have to unlearn just about everything that they have learned to thrive in the real world. Now, what makes everything even more funny is that in modern life, this has turned into a business of its own. Everyone is trying to sell you someone else's strategy for how to succeed or win at life. And I'm sorry to say, but eating the same breakfast as your favorite athlete or Hollywood star or business person every morning is not going to make you an equally great athlete, Hollywood star, or even a great business person. Things don't work that way. But with the amount of money that there are in things like endorsements and sponsorships, you would think that things do work that way. Anyways, back to our strategy of rushing. Some of the more seasoned academic people in business were trained in this rushing strategy and came up with the term first mover advantage. You rush into things as fast as you can and hit your competitors before they even know what's going on, and then you win. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's got a whiff of my video game rush strategy from Age of Empires about it, doesn't it? It's a clever term, this first mover advantage. It automatically forces you to think that by moving first, you get an advantage. An advantage is a positive term, a happy term. Having an advantage is a good thing. But does moving first give you one? Well, let's try to look at some examples. Ask a company like Microsoft about how being second to the graphical user interface worked out for them in terms of having the most widely adopted computer operating system. Ask a company like Apple about what it was like to be the last mover in the world of MP3 players. But maybe advantage to your company is both adoption and profit. Maybe then you could ask the people who made things like the BlackBerry smartphone what it was like to be the first movers in the world of smartphones, if you could even call them that, only to have Apple come in with the iPhone later. Go back in time and ask the Ford Motor Company, who were the first to make the car, how a little company called Toyota came late to the party and pulled the rug out from under them. The world is so complex that the notion of first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and last don't even have any consistent meaning. Is a BlackBerry really the first smartphone? Is the iPhone the second, the last? Things change position based on how you draw the lines. Dogma, like first mover advantage, is almost always a poor, low-dimensional attempt to capture and distill the wondrous and indistillable nuance of reality. Reality is something that just is, in all of its complex and messy glory. You can't reduce it. You have to face it head on, and you have to adapt to it. Change your strategy when it demands it. You have to know how to unlearn everything you know, because often you will be dealt with situations that you and no other human who has ever lived have encountered before. And still, even with the world's best adaptability, you are guaranteed nothing in return. Now, that's not to say that some elements of the real world don't have optimal strategies, but these elements are highly constrained and controlled. If you get to go first in a game like tic-tac-toe and put your mark in the center, you have a better chance of winning. If you want to blast something into orbit, you want to make sure you hit orbital velocities as part of your blast things into orbit strategy. Unlike a game, the mechanics of the real world are not designed to reward you based on the correct strategy. While some simpler things may have more optimal approaches, often there is no correct strategy at all. There is no equation waiting to be solved, and even if there was, we don't know that all equations can be solved. And yet, I can't say that I didn't learn anything at all from games that I could then turn around and apply to the real world. I didn't learn any strategies, no. I didn't learn economics or anything of that sort, no. Every strategy that I learned within the games that I played was largely catered to that game. But I learned that games and real life are not the same thing. Being good at one doesn't make you good at the other, except perhaps in some small ways. I have great dexterity with a mouse and keyboard, no doubt thanks to having played fast-paced games on the computer growing up. And of course, I learned that strategy is not something you decide on based on what you want to achieve. Strategy is something that you stumble over on a iterative and ongoing basis based on the conditions that you are facing at any given moment. Because things change all the time, whether you are aware of those changes or not. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider going to iTunes and leaving us a good review. Thank you.